I turned 29 on a rainy Thursday. My sister handed me a DNA test kit across the dinner table, wrapped in silver paper and sarcasm. "Just to make sure we're really sisters," she joked. Everyone laughed. Loudly. I smiled too, because that's what you do when you're the quiet one at the table. But later that night, I skipped cake, slipped the box into my bag, and drove home, in silence, wondering why the joke didn't feel that funny. I didn't open the box that night. It sat on my kitchen counter, still wrapped in silver paper, like a forgotten gift no one had the heart to throw away. I didn't have the heart either. I poured a glass of wine, stared at it across the room, and told myself it was just a joke. That Sophia didn't mean anything by it. That maybe, after everything, I was just too sensitive. The next morning, I found myself thinking about it again as I pulled on a cardigan and tied my hair back. I was supposed to meet a client in the city, but all I could think about was the look on Sophia's face when she handed it to me. The way her smile curled just a little too much at the corner. The way Mom looked down at her plate, chewing too slowly. No one questioned the joke. No one said, "Hey, that's a weird gift." They all just laughed like it was the most natural thing in the world to doubt if I belonged. I didn't always feel like the outsider. When we were kids, Sophia used to walk me to school. She'd hold my hand too tight when we crossed the street. I remember the smell of her strawberry shampoo, the way she used to tuck my scarf in before letting go. But at some point, I stopped being someone to protect. I became someone to manage, to keep on the sidelines. I never got invited to board meetings or strategy retreats. My opinions were always interesting, which was code for unnecessary. By noon, I'd moved the DNA kit from the counter to my work bag, not because I planned to do it, just so it wouldn't stare at me anymore. I went through the motions of the day, emails, calls, one awkward lunch, with a colleague who kept calling me Ms. Donovan, like he couldn't believe I was a Donovan. That night, I called Mom. I told myself I just wanted to say thank you for the dinner, but I think I needed to hear something more. Maybe a sign that the joke wasn't a joke, that I wasn't imagining things. She picked up on the third ring. "Oh, hi, sweetie," she said. Background noise, TV, maybe dishes. "Hi," I said, that just wanted to say, "Thanks for dinner. It was nice." There was a pause, like she was waiting for the other shoe. "You're welcome. You looked beautiful, by the way." I smiled into the silence. "Yeah. About the gift." "Oh," she said quickly. "Sophia's idea, you know how she is, always making jokes." I waited. Nothing followed. "Yeah," I said. It was funny. Another pause. "You're not actually going to do it, are you?" I blinked. "What?" She laughed lightly. "The test. It's silly." "I don't know," I said. "Maybe, just for fun. You don't need to prove anything," she said. I know I said, and hung up 5 minutes later with a knot in my stomach I couldn't explain. The test sat in my drawer for another week. I'd see it when I went looking for stamps or headphones, and each time I'd shut the drawer a little harder. Then, one night, after a particularly long meeting where I was introduced as Sophia's sister, and not by name, I pulled it out, followed the instructions and mailed it in. No fanfare, no dramatic music, just me alone at 10:43 p.m, spitting into a plastic tube under fluorescent kitchen lights. There was no expectation. I didn't think it would change anything. I didn't think it would confirm or deny anything important. I think I just wanted to see if I could take something that was meant to dismiss me and turn it into something else, something real. When I dropped it into the mailbox, I felt nothing. Not relief, not triumph, just quiet, like setting down a heavy bag I didn't realize I'd been carrying. And Maybe I told myself maybe it would come back and prove once and for all what I'd always feared deep down. Or maybe it would do the opposite. Maybe it would tell me I belonged more than anyone else ever realised. I didn't tell anyone I sent it in. Not Sophia, not Mom, not my boyfriend, who kept asking why I was more distracted than usual. I just waited, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I needed to explain myself. Until the email came in. The email didn't say much, just a subject line. Your DNA results are ready, and a link I couldn't bring myself to click. Not yet. Not before I replayed everything that brought me here. It's funny how memory works. What came to mind first wasn't some pivotal childhood moment or a huge family fight. It was that night at the company's 40th anniversary gala. We held it at the downtown ballroom, one of those places with too many mirrors and not enough air. Everything was gold and white and loud. I wore navy blue because black felt too somber and red too loud. I was in charge of vendor check-ins, flower arrangements, playlist transitions, basically everything that happened off stage. The kind of things people forget someone had to do, but someone always did, and that someone was usually me. I remember adjusting the uplighting near the back curtain when someone tapped my shoulder. A man in a tailored suit holding a glass of red wine, grinning politely. "Excuse me, could you tell me where the restroom is?" I smiled, nodded, pointed. He glanced at my name tag. "Ah, Aria. That's a pretty name. You must be new on staff." I blinked. "Actually, she's my daughter," came my mother's voice. I turned. She was standing beside us holding her clutch with both hands. Her tone wasn't proud or affectionate, just factual, like she was correcting a typo. The man's face changed. "Oh, apologies, I didn't realise." "It's all right," I said quickly. "I get that a lot." Mum didn't say anything else, just gave me a small nod and walked toward the front tables where Sophia was already seated next to the mayor. Her dress sparkled in the light. Everyone noticed her. I lingered a few moments longer in the hallway. My clipboard felt heavier than it was. I checked the vendor timing again, even though the catering had already started, and the violinist was mid-set. Busy hands keep quiet minds. Later that night, as guests toasted and violins played softly near the chocolate fountain, Sophia took the stage. The applause was instant, too warm, too practiced. She waved, grinned, then leaned into the mic, like she'd been waiting for this moment her whole life. "I want to thank everyone here," she began, "for believing in our vision, for supporting our legacy, and for being part of something bigger than all of us. Our vision, our legacy." She went on to talk about our father, how he built the company from nothing, how she stood beside him since day one, how proud he would have been to see this night. She spoke with conviction, eloquence, purpose. My name didn't come up, not once. I stood in the back, holding a clipboard that didn't need holding anymore. My feet ached, my throat felt tight, and I kept thinking how I hadn't even gotten a seat at the front tables. My assigned seat was near the sound techs. Table 14. I caught Mum's eye during the speech. She looked back for half a second, then turned to the woman beside her and whispered something. They both laughed. I don't know what she said, but it wasn't about me. After the speech, I walked outside for air. The cold hit fast, but it cleared my head. I leaned against the brick wall and looked up. The ballroom windows glowed with gold light. Inside, Sophia was surrounded, shaking hands, smiling like she was born for it. I used to think I was just late to the game, that if I worked harder, studied more, stayed quiet, long enough someone would eventually notice. But it didn't work that way. In our family, presence was louder than effort. and Sophia had always been the loudest. That night, when I got home, I opened my old high school journal, the one with stickers on the inside flap. I hadn't written in it for years, but I flipped to a random page anyway. On that page, in sloppy handwriting, it said, "One day, I'll be more than the girl behind the curtain." It stung to read that, because I wasn't sure if I ever would be. I thought of the gala speeches I wrote that no one knew I wrote, of the website redesign I project managed without a single credit, of the strategy memo I drafted that Sophia sent with her name on it. None of it was enough to move me out of the wings. I remember sitting on the floor of my room, legs crossed, the journal open on my lap, thinking, if they never see me, maybe I need to stop waiting for them to look. That's when I picked up my laptop again. The email was still there, still unopened, but not for long. I clicked the email that night, not because I expected anything, but because I was tired of circling the same silence. The results would take a few days to finalise some message about processing timelines and sample validation, but I didn't close the tab. I just let it sit open while I stared at the glow of the screen. I don't know why, but it made me think about the summer after college, when I asked Mum if I could intern at the company. It wasn't some grand ambition. I wasn't trying to take over. I just wanted in. I wanted to learn the business from the inside, to feel like part of it. I remember standing in her office holding my printed resume, even though it was mostly fluff school clubs, one research assistant gig, a part-time barista job. I was nervous, but trying to sound confident. I thought it might be good experience, I said, and I could help out however needed. Mom didn't look up from her screen. She was reviewing something red lines all over the margins. "You don't want to just enjoy your summer?" she asked. I smiled. This is me enjoying it. That made her pause. She finally looked up. "Arya, this company needs decisive people. People who take initiative, who can make fast calls. That's not really your strength." I blinked. I can learn. She softened, but not really. "It's not personal. It's just, you hesitate, you overthink. We don't have time for that in leadership." I wanted to say I wasn't asking for leadership. I was asking for a chance to be helpful, to be visible, but the word stuck. And anyway, I knew what she meant. Sophia had joined Dad's meetings at 19. She shadowed his calls, made recommendations, got her own email address at 22. Me, I was the one who edited her PowerPoints, who made coffee runs and proofread newsletters when asked. I left her office that day, holding the same resume creased now from my grip. I didn't cry, just went home and applied to a summer grad program out of state, marketing analytics, not because I loved it, but because it felt concrete. Numbers don't care if your name is on the building. I worked 2 jobs while studying, lived in a sublet where the heat barely worked and the hallway smelled like someone's failed cooking experiment. But it was mine, and no one could say I was handed anything. I stayed 3 years, got a job with a small firm that handled pharmaceutical clients. The irony wasn't lost on me, and I only ever came back for holidays, weddings, funerals. And the gala, of course. Always the gala. Always the same seat near the back. Sometimes I wondered if Mum even remembered that summer. If she knew that "you hesitate too much" became a voice I carried in every meeting, every presentation, every moment I doubted if I had the right to speak. I don't think she meant it cruelly. But cruelty isn't always sharp. Sometimes it's just repeated enough that it stops needing to raise its voice. That's what I was thinking about as I watched the progress bar on the DNA site, waiting quietly again. But this time, not to be chosen, just to know. That phrase kept echoing in my head, even as I went through the motions of a perfectly normal week team meetings at my firm lunch with a client. Small talk over coffee about industry trends. But in the quiet corners of my mind, I kept drifting back to that summer, the one I'd tried so hard to forget. I remembered overhearing Dad's voice in the hallway once talking to Sophia. "She means well, but Aria's too soft for this business." I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. I just froze like a child again, hoping maybe he'd say something after that. Some kind of balance. But he didn't. Sophia had laughed soft-pleased and said she's better with books than boardrooms. I remember the pit in my stomach, that feeling of being watched but never truly seen. That was the first time I seriously considered not coming back after school. Not because I didn't care about the company. I did. I knew every inch of it, its founding stories, its risks, its rise, but because I couldn't stand walking those halls knowing I was invisible unless someone needed a favour. It wasn't just about the internship. It was about identity. About how no matter how much I loved them, they didn't love me in the way that made space for me to belong. Maybe that's what drove me to work harder than I needed to rack up certifications, take night courses, volunteer for the toughest accounts. Not because I needed approval from them anymore, but because a part of me wanted to be undeniable. The funny thing is, I never wanted to take anything from Sophia. I wasn't interested in replacing her, outshining her, proving her wrong. I just wanted room to stand, to not feel like a guest in my own story. That's why the DNA kit felt like a strange kind of metaphor. Wrapped in laughter, handed to me as a joke, it somehow held the possibility of a truth I wasn't even looking for. But the more I thought about it, the more I realised I wasn't afraid of the result. I was afraid it might confirm what I'd always suspected, that I wasn't part of them in the way I thought. That I was just a polite guest with the same last name. So, yes, maybe I hesitated. Maybe I overthought. But eventually, I stopped waiting for someone to tell me who I was and started asking the only thing that might answer without bias. The kit had been sitting on my dresser for days, unopened, like a dare I hadn't yet accepted. Every morning I'd glance at it while getting dressed, its cheerful blue box and neat white lettering almost obnoxiously bright against the quiet greys of my room. It didn't look like something meant to change lives. It looked like a novelty gift, which I suppose it was. But each time I caught sight of it, something stirred. Not urgency exactly, more like a quiet tap on the shoulder. A reminder. I finally opened it on a Saturday. The house was still. No meetings, no deadlines. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional bark of the neighbour's dog. I followed the instructions carefully. Swab, seal, register, online. I tried to treat it like a task, nothing more, nothing less. Like paying bills or renewing my car registration. Something mundane. But my hands trembled just slightly as I slid the swab into the vial and clicked the lid shut. It was such a small thing. Just plastic, cotton, and whatever part of me existed on a cellular level. But somehow it felt heavier than that. I printed the shipping label and found a padded envelope in my desk drawer. Tucked the vial inside like it was something precious, even though part of me still thought this whole thing was absurd. I mean, what did I think would happen? That the test would suddenly declare me a stranger in my own family? Or worse, that it would confirm I was part of it? But they still wouldn't see me. I didn't know which answer scared me more. But I sealed the envelope anyway. Wrote my return address with a deliberate steadiness. Then I drove to the post office. It was quiet there too. Late afternoon. No line, Just a teenager behind the counter wearing earbuds and chewing gum like he'd mastered both into an art form. I didn't approach him. Instead, I walked past the counter to the blue mailbox outside. It stood near the parking lot, battered and sun-faded, surrounded by a small patch of dying grass. I stood in front of it for longer than I care to admit. The envelope felt warm in my hand from being in my jacket pocket. I turned it over once, then again. Read the barcode, tapped it against my palm. There was no reason to hesitate. And yet, I thought about Sophia's laugh, about the way Mum always introduced her first at events, about Dad's voice on the phone calling her his rock. I thought about every time I'd been asked if I was a friend of the family at corporate functions, every time someone had looked past me in a room where I knew all the numbers, but none of the names on the walls. And then I thought about something simpler, my own face in the mirror. The slope of my nose, the shape of my eyes, the things I'd inherited without ever being asked. I took a deep breath, and then I let the envelope drop. It made a soft, final sound as it landed inside. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just done. I stood there for a few seconds more looking at the slot like it might change its mind. Then I turned around and walked back to my car. I didn't tell anyone, not Sophia, not Mom, not even James, though he asked what I'd done that afternoon. I said errands, which wasn't a lie, just not the kind he expected. And as I drove home, the sky already darkening, I felt something unfamiliar settle over me. Not regret, not relief, just a quiet kind of resolve. Whatever came next, I wanted to know. The email came the next morning just before 8 a.m, right as I was pouring coffee into a chipped mug that still had Sophia's college logo on it. I stared at the subject line, "Your DNA results are ready," and didn't click. Not right away. Instead, I let the coffee cool while I sat at the kitchen table, phone in one hand, thumb hovering. I told myself I needed a clear head. I told myself it wasn't urgent. But the truth was, I already felt something, shifting like the world was about to nudge itself off its usual axis, and I wasn't sure which way it would spin. But I didn't open it. Not yet. Because before I could, another email popped up. This one from a name I didn't recognize. A partner from the family's law firm. I clicked it before I even thought about it. It was a forwarded agenda for an internal meeting scheduled that afternoon. Distribution of founders' shares, the subject line read. My name wasn't on the recipient list. I only got it because someone must have accidentally typed Aria instead of Ariana, one of Sophia's assistants. There it was, the kind of mistake that changed everything. The document was straightforward. A breakdown of company equity revisions to be presented to the board. 60% to go to Sophia. The rest to be divided among senior executives. None to me. No mention of my name. Not even a courtesy line. Nothing. I stared at the screen, then read it again slower. Every line confirmed it. I wasn't just being overlooked, I was being written out. Officially. Strategically, permanently. I couldn't even blame it on forgetfulness anymore. They'd made a decision. A clean one. All we need is Sophia. The lawyer had typed in an internal note, accidentally left in the footer. I reread that line so many times it started to look like a joke, like the punchline to a long, tired comedy I hadn't realised I was starring in. And that's when I did it. I opened the DNA results. My hands didn't shake this time. I just tapped the link and waited. The page loaded slowly, painfully, like it knew what it was carrying. I scrolled past the bright green welcome message, past the health predictions and ancestry pie charts. I went straight to the section marked immediate family. And then I saw it. My mother, listed. My father, listed. Sophia, absent. Not inconclusive. Not uncertain. Just not there. Not biologically related. The words stared up at me like they'd been waiting to be seen. I closed the laptop, sat still for a long time. There wasn't any shouting in my head. No sense of vindication or rage. Just an eerie kind of clarity. The kind that makes everything else seem louder. The buzz of the fridge, the ticking clock, the faint bark of the dog next door. I stood up, printed the report. All 32 pages of it, even though I only needed one. Then I found the folder where I'd kept the company's bylaws, the ones Dad had let me read when I was 17, because I'd asked to see them for a school project. Article 4, Section 6. Founders' shares may only be transferred to direct biological descendants unless otherwise specified in the deceased's notarized will. There was no will, just his signature on those bylaws. That was the day I stopped waiting to be included. I didn't call anyone. I didn't text Sophia or ask Mom for an explanation. I just packed a small bag, took the printed results and the bylaws, and drove to my old professor's law office. He owed me a favour, and I needed someone who didn't owe my family anything. He read the papers in silence, lips pressed into a thin line. "You know what this means?" he said finally. "Yes," I answered. "And you're ready for this?" he asked. I looked at him and didn't hesitate. "I'm not taking anything that isn't mine." He nodded. "Then we'll start by freezing the share transfer until this is reviewed." That night, I slept for 6 hours straight. No dreams. No waking up at 3 a.m, wondering if I'd done enough. Just sleep. The kind you earn when the fog finally lifts. The kind you get when you stop waiting for permission to matter. I woke up the next morning with a strange stillness in my chest, like my body hadn't yet realised how much had shifted. The sunlight poured through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the floor, and for a second everything felt almost normal. Almost. Then I remembered. The folder on the nightstand, the DNA report, the sentence printed in unassuming font as if it hadn't just cracked open the foundation of everything I knew. Not biologically related. I said the words aloud once softly, like testing a foreign language on my tongue. They didn't sound dramatic. They sounded clinical, cold, factual. There was no tremble in my voice, no gasp, just breath. I opened the folder again. Page 4, Immediate Family. My name listed beside both parents, Sophia's name missing entirely. I studied the layout like a blueprint as if understanding its design might make it less surreal. But the truth sat plainly there as neutral and irrefutable as math. Sophia and I weren't full sisters. We weren't even half. She was my mother's child, perhaps, but not my father's. And in our family, that meant everything. The company, the shares, the legacy, it had always been about blood, about lineage. Dad had said it often back when I was still young enough to sit on his office floor with my homework. This company is your inheritance, not just in assets, but in identity, he'd say, tapping his chest. It runs in here, not in titles or salaries, in DNA. I used to think that was poetic. Now I knew it was policy, legal, binding policy. I didn't cry. I didn't even call anyone. I just sat there letting the knowledge settle, like a dust cloud finally thinning. Then I walked to the desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up the email to my lawyer. Subject line, additional documentation. I attached the full PDF and typed one sentence. Please add this to the file and proceed accordingly. No explanation, no commentary, just the facts. I hit send and stared at the screen for a long moment. The cursor blinked back at me, steady and unbothered, unlike me. Later that day, James asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I said no, not because I didn't want to be with him, but because I didn't trust my ability to make small talk while the tectonic plates of my identity still shifted underfoot. I stayed inside. I reheated soup I didn't eat. I folded laundry twice. And every so often I looked at the report again. Like it might change. Like the truth could rewrite itself if I caught it at the right angle. But it never did. It just stared back, unchanged, quietly explosive. By the time the sun dipped behind the neighbour's roof, I'd begun writing out a timeline. Meetings, documents, quotes from Dad, the bylaws, everything I remembered. It wasn't emotional, it was administrative, strategic. A record not of grief, but of clarity. Because the thing was, I didn't want to burn the house down. I just wanted to know once and for all that I had a key, that I hadn't been trespassing in my own narrative. And now I had proof. The next morning my lawyer called. His voice was calm, but I heard the shift underneath it. This changes everything, he said. I nodded, even though he couldn't see. We'll file an injunction first, he added. Stop the transfer until the board can review this properly. No press, no escalation yet. Yet. That word sat heavy in the air. Okay, I said. Let's proceed. Because nothing about the truth had made me feel triumphant. But it had made me feel sure. And that was enough. I read the company charter in my kitchen at 2 a.m, barefoot, the fridge humming like it was trying to calm me. The document was old, updated in fonts that hadn't been trendy in years, filled with phrases like successive beneficiary and founder clause. I had printed it out instead of reading it on a screen. Something about the weight of the paper made it feel more real, more final. A glass of wine sat half-finished next to me untouched for an hour. I wasn't drinking, I was decoding. Page 7, Section C, Subclause. 4. Only direct, legitimate, biological descendants of the founder shall retain entitlement to founding class shares. I traced the sentence with my finger. Read it once. Twice. It didn't change. I felt something settle in me, not quite victory and definitely not anger, just clarity. That word again, legitimate. I used to hate it back when it came up in whispered conversations about birthrights or family inheritance. But now, it was written here in black ink and legal font, deciding who had a rightful seat at the table. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about who Dad trusted or mentored. It was blood and law. And by both, I was the only one who belonged. I thought about calling James. He'd always been the pragmatic one, always telling me to think through before jumping. But I didn't want advice. Not this time. I wanted facts, documents, timestamps. So instead, I opened my laptop, pulled up the lawyer's contact and began an email. I attached the DNA report, then a scanned copy of the clause from the charter. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I typed, I'd like to discuss the implications of this clause in light of the enclosed document. Can we schedule a meeting this week? I hit send before I could overthink it. That had always been their favourite word for me, overthinker. I guess they weren't wrong. But this wasn't indecision. This was precision. There's a difference. Outside, the night was still. I walked to the window and leaned my forehead against the cool glass. Below, the city slept under a wash of sodium lights and blurry taillights. Somewhere out there, Sophia was probably asleep in Dad's penthouse. The same one he used to say I'd live in one day if I ever toughened up. But the truth was, toughness had never been the issue. It was the quiet things, endurance, restraint to the ability to wait until the right moment. I had those. I had always had those. They just didn't count them as strengths. The next morning, the lawyer replied. His message was brief, almost curt. This raises significant questions. Let's meet Thursday. Bring everything you have. I stared at the screen for a moment, letting the weight of those words register. Significant questions, not assumptions, not gossip. Questions that deserved answers. Legal ones. I printed the email, filed it with the DNA result, the charter copy, and even the envelope it came in. I didn't know if I'd need it, but something told me I should keep every piece. I went over to the hall closet and dug out the old leather folder Dad had given me years ago when I graduated. I remember him saying, "Put your degrees in here. Maybe someday something bigger too." I don't think he meant this, but I slid the documents inside anyway. It felt like the folder had finally found its purpose. That night, I drove past the office building. It was nearly empty, just a few lights glowing in the executive wing. Sophia's car wasn't there. I parked across the street engine off headlights dimmed. I sat there for 15 minutes watching shadows move behind the blinds. I thought about how many birthdays I'd celebrated in that building. How many times I'd been told kindly but firmly that maybe the company wasn't the best fit. Not because I wasn't capable, but because they'd already chosen who belonged. And I hadn't been it. I remembered one conversation with Mum a few years back. I had asked if I could join a strategy meeting. She smiled politely and said, "Aria, sweetheart, those are intense. I think you'd find them draining." I had nodded, swallowed the sting, walked out. That sting hadn't gone anywhere. It had just buried itself deeper. And now I didn't feel stung. I felt ready. I saw her there first thing in the morning, leaning against the kitchen counter, as if waiting for me to break a habit I'd been building up for years, avoiding breakfast, avoiding questions. She held her mug of tea with both hands, shoulders, squared lips, curved into that practiced smile that always looked just a little too polite, like someone clearing her throat before a speech. I carried my coffee, the leather folder heavy with possibility tucked under my arm, and paused in the doorway, still not sure how to begin. "Morning," I said, voice low even. She glanced at me, her eyes flicking past my face like she was scanning a crowd to find someone else. "Morning," she said, nodding once, lifting her cup a little higher. I leaned against the fridge, watching her take a measured sip. Tiny inhale, slow exhale, like she was bracing herself. I thought about placing the folder on the counter, pushing it toward her, letting it slide across the surface, demanding the conversation. But I stayed still. "I emailed Mr. Klein this morning," I said, wrapping my fingers tighter around my cup to hide the tremor. "About the charter, about my rights." Her chin lifted slightly. She paused, mid-sip, the mug halfway to her lips. The moment stretched. I could hear the refrigerator hum, the kettle clicking off in its chamber, mundane sounds pretending nothing was about to shift. Her face didn't change. "All that paperwork," she said, voice soft but steady. "You really think it matters?" I wanted to fire something back, a question, a shot. Instead, I offered a calm confession. "I think knowing the truth matters." My words were measured, but beneath them until that point, I felt nothing but brittle resolve. I expected her to challenge me. She narrowed her eyes, dangerous, but she said nothing. Just lowered her mug with almost too much caution, finger tracing the rim. I stepped closer, noticing how the morning light fell differently on her, highlighting every line, every grey hair she'd hidden for so long, like the truth in my folder. "You know," I said slowly, "there are things not hidden, Mum. They're waiting for someone to look." Part of me feared her reaction, but the part in control wouldn't let me stop. Her eyes shifted away, tracing along the tile backsplash, pretending to read something titled Recipes, unaware I'd seen her glance at our wedding photo taped there. She set down her cup with surprising force, looked at me through the reflection in the fridge door. "Aria," she breathed almost a reprimand. "What do you think you'll find with this thing?" She gestured vaguely at the empty air between us. The silence was too long. I heard my heart gallop, but I remembered my purpose steadied myself. I'm not looking to break anything I said. I just want the truth to stand on its own. Her mouth tightened as if tasting something bitter before swallowing. Her posture stiffened, shoulders rising like a passing storm. She looked away. Maybe, she said, voice soft as ash, "Some things are better left unsaid." That was it, the phrase I'd heard my whole life. Better left unsaid. Not this one, not today. Not when everything was quiet like this. Maybe, I replied, matching her tone, some truths shouldn't be hidden anymore. She said nothing. The unspoken weight filled every inch of the kitchen. I imagined it thickening in the air between us. Decades of expectations, disappointments, survival. My throat stung. I swallowed, looked past her to the window above the sink. The sky was pale blue, nothing like the storms we were brewing. "I'm going to work," I said, voice-neutral decisions made. She didn't ask where, didn't follow. She just stood there, her profile stiff and still. I paused at the doorway, breathing through the moment, trying not to cry or rage, just to hold steady. "Mum," I called softly. She still didn't move. I didn't wait. I didn't add anything else. I left. The car was quiet as I drove away, but my head buzzed. I replayed the morning, her eyes, the tilt of her head, every sigh. The sting was there, deep and unfamiliar, but it wasn't pain anymore. It was something like freedom. Freedom to carry my folder, my truth, without feeling unworthy. That night, I sat at my desk with the leather folder open in front of me. The kitchen memory lingered, her words lingering. Better left unsaid, but the rest of my life didn't believe that. I opened my laptop, drafted an email to Mr. Klein's assistant, meeting confirmed. We will bring necessary documentation. I hovered over send, breath held, and then clicked. I went to bed later, exhausted but steady. No handshake, no fake smiles, no acting like the polite guest with the same last name. I slept the kind of sleep earned through courage. The next morning, I woke to a ping. "Your DNA results are ready." I closed my eyes, felt the sun press through the blinds. Everything was changing whether I opened the email or not. I rolled out of bed, the weight of the day ahead settling in my chest. I made coffee without thinking, mechanical ritual. The aroma filled the kitchen, but it offered no comfort. I was preparing for something that felt less like confrontation and more like an unveiling of truth, long hidden. By mid-morning, I was in motion. I drove to my father's old office building, the one he leased before giving it to Sophia to manage. The lobby was empty, early commuters gone, and the echo of my footsteps felt heavy in those vaulted halls. I remembered accompanying Dad here once, a small hand in his eyes bright with pride. Now I stood alone, clutching a folder that contained much more than paper. It held my identity, my claim, my stand. I slipped into the copy centre on the second floor. The hum of the printer was familiar, almost comforting. I queued the documents, the printed email from the testing company, the pages of the original charter with the phrase, "Only legitimate biological children may hold founder shares," circled carefully, and the notarized family tree Sophia had pinned on the board last year. While the machines whirred, I pressed my palm against the glass door, watching the copier feed sheet after sheet, like a metronome counting down to tomorrow's board meeting. My heart beat with a quiet certainty. When I left, the packets under my arm felt heavier than when I entered. I paused at the elevator lobby and instinctively scanned the hallway. The cleaning staff, a familiar face, gave me a nod. I returned it with a small, authentic smile, something I rarely allowed myself at home. I was looking for reassurance, and maybe I found it in that simple human exchange. She didn't know what was in the folder, but she treated me as if I belonged. Back in my car, I laid out the documents on the passenger seat. I touched the email's timestamp, 8:04 a.m., and the marker on the charter. I whispered to myself, I don't need to fight. I just need clarity. I felt that phrase ripple through me, straightening my spine. I thought about all those times I'd begged for space at the table, at dinners, at meetings, during company events. Now I'd carved that space. It wasn't given, I was taking it. That afternoon, I arranged the meeting room at Dad's house. I moved chairs into position around the polished table. 11 seats, 8 for board members, 1 for Sophia, 1 for Mom, and 1 empty reserved for me. I labelled my seat with a single name card, printed in crisp typeface Aria Martin. It felt surreal to set a place for myself, in a room where I'd always sat on the margins. Next, I met my lawyer at a quiet cafe a few blocks away. She handed me a sleek black USB drive. This has the full file, she said, sliding it across to me. We're legally ready. We reviewed the timing we'd give Sophia and Mum, a copy 1 hour before the meeting as required. No surprises, just facts. Her clarity mirrored mine. Later, I called James. I'd been avoiding the conversation, but I couldn't now. Tomorrow, I said, I need space. I'll update you. He didn't say much. Solidarity is sometimes quieter than support. His silence rooted me. I realised I wasn't doing this to break the family, just to set my place within it. That evening, I stopped by the small botanical shop Dad used to visit. The florist greeted me and handed a single white orchid. For new beginnings, she asked. My eyes stung. I nodded. I placed it on my kitchen island at home alongside the folders and the printed charter pages. A small signpost in the midst of upheaval. Night fell without fanfare, but sleep came easier than expected, not restful, but purposeful. I dreamed of the boardroom polished wood morning light streaming through glass walls, my reflection on the door. I woke before dawn. Tomorrow I would walk into that room. No need to shout, no need for theatrics. I would simply sit where I belonged. Because clarity has its own power, and I was done waiting in the shadows. The boardroom door clicked quietly behind me as I entered. I carried 2 neat stacks in front of me. One was the DNA result, the other, the company charter. I placed them gently in front of the chairman's seat. The early morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the documents without fanfare. No drum roll needed, just truth. The room was bigger than most. Mahogany panelled walls, leather chairs, a long polished table. I took my seat, folding my hands. Across from me, Sophia's sharp suit felt like a shield she'd worn her whole life. Today, it wouldn't help. Our mother sat beside her, composed but distant, the same posture she'd adopted whenever serious decisions were being made without my input. A few board members exchanged glances. My father leaned back, expression vague. I cleared my throat. Thank you all for being here. I looked around the table, not pleading, just observing. Silence. Then I spoke. Sophia gave me the DNA kit as a joke, I said, voice even and steady. A public joke at my birthday. My words echoed. I opened the top page, but I didn't treat it like one. I slid the DNA result across the table. the first sheet encountering tense hands. The lab report reads, "Not biologically related. Sophia, you and this company's legal counsel can verify there is no biological connection between you and Dad." I watched Sophia's face shift shock, confusion, the first crack in her self-confidence. At least not enough to meet the criteria. I lifted the charter and opened directly to the clause I'd highlighted in coral ink. The company, Charter Article 4A, only legitimate biological children of the founder may hold founder shares. It's clear, unambiguous. My fingers tapped the clause. By that definition, and by law, I am the only true founder's child. I let the words hang. Board members shifted. One cleared her throat. This is significant. That was an understatement. I met my father's gaze. He didn't smile. He didn't look away. He just blinked. I spoke again, calm as dawn. I'm here to exercise the rights granted by this charter. I will assume legal founder status and claim founder shares accordingly. Sophia's mouth open, closed, no sound. You gave me the test as a joke, I said, rising only enough to look her in the eye. I used it to reclaim what was mine. My voice didn't crack. I folded the charter and set it down. I don't need to fight. I just need clarity, and that clarity is here. My tone left no room for argument. Pausing, I watched her. She swallowed. Our mother's lips quivered slightly. The chairman cleared his throat. This will take time, he said. Board procedure must be followed. Fair, legal, procedural. I nodded, understood. But this needs to be resolved by the end of the day. My resolve buzzed quietly like a low hum. This wasn't aggression, it was assertion. The board clerk jotted notes. Sophia finally spoke, voice soft. Aria, so, you're going to take over. I leaned back. By law, I am the only one with the rights to founder shares. What happens next is your call. I met her eyes. You can stay, as CEO employee, or leave. The choice is yours. Chairs creaked. A director cleared his throat. We'll need formal documentation, transition plan. My lawyer's email pinged in my pocket. I tilted my head slightly. I have everything ready. My face stayed smooth, but inside my heart struck a single clear chord: freedom. Nothing had felt this clean in years. Sophia nodded, tears glistening, lips pressed tight. No words. Our mother's hand tightened on the armrest, as if bracing herself. My father exhaled long and quiet. The room exhaled with him. Then the chairman said, "With that, we'll adjourn and reconvene this afternoon." I leaned forward, gently picking up the DNA result and charter, folding them together as if wrapping up a package, truth wrapped in paper. I stood. No applause, just the sound of my heels on marble floor as I walked to the door past their stunned faces. Outside the boardroom, I paused by the window. Morning light flooded around me, bright, honest. I reached for my phone and typed, "Founder, shares claimed. Meeting ended. We'll send transition doc shortly." I hit send. The message felt like closure, or perhaps a beginning. Because I hadn't been seeking revenge, I had been seeking definition, a rightful place held firmly, the kind that no birthday joke could ever erase. I stepped back as the chairman cleared his throat again, signalling the end of the meeting. Chairs scraped, moments passed in silence thicker than any argument. Sophia stared at her lap, her hands wringing. She didn't look at me. Our mother inhaled, bowed her head, tiny, almost imperceptible, like the air had finally drained out of her. I realized then that freedom doesn't need a dramatic entrance. It doesn't need loud declarations or sweeping gestures. All it needs is truth. In that silence, I felt unmoored from decades of waiting for permission to matter. A board member cleared her throat. Ms. Turner, she began using the professional name I'd adopted at work. I met her eyes and nodded. Everything had been said. Nothing left to prove. I stood up, gathering the DNA result and company charter from the table. With measured calm, I walked toward the door without looking back. The finality of that walk, the firmness in each step, was the rebellion, not raising my voice but showing up. But as I pushed the boardroom door open, the world outside felt wide, brighter, quieter, unburdened. I let the documents rest against my hip fingertips, brushing their edges. My heart wasn't racing. There was only clarity, sharp, steady. Outside the hall, I found my mother and Sophia lingering. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed chin trembling. Sophia's chest rose and fell unevenly. She looked like a bird whose wing had finally been clipped. I paused a moment, unsure what to say. She's still my sister, I reminded myself, but that didn't mean I owed her reassurance. Instead, I stepped around them toward my father's office at the end of the corridor. His door was closed. I heard nothing. No soft footsteps, no muffled voice. I walked deliberately, feeling the weight of everything I used to carry lighten with each footfall. I paused at the door, one hand hovering over the aged brass handle. I thought of the times I'd begged for acknowledgement, his approving nod at my student presentations, his absence from my volunteer award ceremonies. I thought of the way he'd always smiled for Sophia first, the way his voice softened when she spoke full of pride. But today was different. Today, I had his attention not because of charm performance or quiet competence, because of truth. I took a breath, turned the handle, and stepped in. The room was familiar floor-to-ceiling windows, the same dark wooden desk he always sat behind when I was small, and he gave gentle lectures about responsibility. He looked up when I entered, and the first thing I noticed was how tired he looked. There were lines at the corners of his eyes, less pronounced than before, but still there. He didn't rise. He just focused on me with those steady eyes, the ones I'd always felt I could never quite meet. I closed the door behind me and set the documents on the corner of his desk. My fingers lingered over them, proof of birthright of belonging. Proof of belonging on my own terms, not theirs. He leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach. Aria, he said, no title, no preamble, just my name. There it was, the simplest recognition. Hi, Dad, I said, voice calm. He nodded slowly. Your announcement? You took them by surprise. Truth usually does. He reached for the results, lifted them, examined them. I watched him sift through the papers as though reading my life in those lines. After a moment, he laid them flat, meeting my gaze. I'm sorry, he said. Not a defense, not an excuse, just a confession. And for the first time, I understood that apology wasn't weakness. It was acknowledgement. A bridge. It's okay, I said. You don't need to explain. I just needed clarity. He studied me, and I could almost see the countless internal debates, pride, regret, hope. Finally, he nodded. You're right, he said. Clarity was overdue. I let that moment stand, weightless, solid, enough. I stepped back, reaching for the door. He cleared his throat again. Aria. I paused, but didn't turn around. Not yet. Not until I'd walked out on my own footing. Yes, you earned this. That more than anything felt like recognition. Not for a title or a share, but for me. I exited the office quietly. The corridor was empty, but I felt seen. I glanced back, Dad still seated, reading over the documents again. Behind me, Sophia and Mum were hushed, their silhouettes framed in the open doorway where I'd passed through. I didn't need to say a word. I walked on. As I rounded the corner, bright afternoon light streamed through the windows. My steps felt lighter, each one grounded in my own truth, not theirs. I realized I hadn't taken anything from them. I'd just taken my place. Clutching the files against my side, I walked down the hall, and with each step I felt both the quiet crack of the door closing behind me and the wide world opening ahead. I stood just outside the executive suite and paused, my palm lingering on the frosted glass. I could see the silhouettes of empty chairs around the polished oak table chairs I had never been allowed to sit in until today. My heart fluttered, not with fear, but with something lighter anticipation. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, setting the files down with deliberate calm. The room smelled of leather and ambition as always. Portraits of past leaders lined the walls, sharp suits, confident gazes. I walked to the far end of the table where a single framed photograph rested on a small pedestal by the wall. It was the old family portrait, Sophia standing tall at the centre with Mom and Dad flanking her, all smiles that now seemed painted on. Aria wasn't even in it. My breath caught, but I stayed steady. I carried a new frame in my hands. Under the polished glass was a photo taken earlier that morning staged by HR. The old photo had been replaced with this one, Sophia and Mom on either side, but me in the centre shoulders, back and head high. The lighting captured something I recognised: dignity, ownership, belonging on my own terms. I leaned forward and removed the old photo, sliding it gently out of the frame. It felt like pulling down a curtain on an old act. I didn't look at it. I knew what it said excluded. Then I placed the new frame in its place with a soft click. A right click, a homecoming. Behind me, the door opened again and Dad stepped in. He froze when he saw the picture. Silence stretched between us for a moment longer than I expected. Then he nodded once, a subtle acknowledgement, without words but full meaning. I tilted my head in return, accepting what was unsaid. This was where I belonged now. Sophia entered next, her gaze shifting from the new portrait to me and back again. I held her eye steadily. No anger, no triumph, just clarity. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence said enough. Mum followed hesitation in her step, then sat down at the table. It felt like a ceremony, without guests, without applause, but with weight. I took a breath and moved to sit in the chair at the head of the table. It felt familiar, right? I didn't have to justify it, explain it, or defend it. The papers I'd brought, the DNA report, the company charter correspondence were untouched on the table. They didn't need repeating. The truth was already known. My eyes swept across the room. Dad, Mom, Sophia, each with their own stillness. I felt no rush to fill the silence. Whatever came next would be handled on my timetable. Outside the window, the city hummed, suits rushing past, life carrying on. I closed my eyes for a second and felt peace. Not relief exactly, more like completion. Chapters had closed. New ones were beginning. I stood and gently placed the framed photo on the credenza behind me, enough visible to everyone in the room. I didn't announce it. I didn't need to. The image spoke for me. Then I sat back down and addressed them quietly. I won't say what this proves. You all know it. My voice was steady, measured. I'm not here to erase anyone else's place. I'm here so I don't have to erase myself. I paused, letting that settle. Now I belong, in the clearest way possible. There were no raised voices, no dramatic storming out, just the quiet surrender that comes when truth outweighs drama. Sophia bowed her head the first, then Dad, then Mom. The energy shifted from tension to something slower, something acknowledging. I looked at each of them, And with that closed the unspoken contract. I forgive, but I will not forget. I will not shrink anymore. They watched me leave the room. This time I didn't glance back. The door closed gently behind me. In the hallway, I let out a deep breath. The files and the photo felt lighter in my grip somehow, as if by not fighting for permission I'd already claimed it. The building felt different now, its corridors full of steps I was meant to take. My steps. Morning light filtered through the windows as I walked toward the elevator toward whatever came next. I felt ready. Not because I'd won a battle, but because I'd found my place. Not because others had acknowledged it, but because I had acknowledged it to myself. Now, I belong even if the world didn't clap. Even if my sister stayed silent, even if my parents still hesitated. This was my moment, not defined by a joke or a test, but by every quiet decision, every steady breath, every step I'd taken to stand here. I rode the elevator down without looking at my reflection. I didn't need to check. I knew who I was, and I knew where I'd come from and where I was going. Now I belonged, in the clearest way possible. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, like your presence is tolerated but never quite celebrated, you're not alone. Maybe it shows up in small ways, being left out of group texts, being misintroduced at gatherings, or simply feeling invisible in the place you should feel most known. It's a quiet kind of heartbreak, and it doesn't always come with clear villains or dramatic exits. Sometimes it's just years of subtle erasure. But here's what I've learned. Belonging doesn't always come with permission. Sometimes it's something you claim in silence, by standing tall in the spaces that once made you shrink. Sometimes the clearest truths aren't spoken, they're lived. Right now, more and more people are searching for that clarity through therapy, through journaling, through setting boundaries that once felt impossible. DNA kits, ironically enough, have become part of that journey for many, not just to learn about ancestry, but to confront long-held silences and rewrite the stories we were told. Healing isn't always loud. It often starts with a single step, choosing to stop proving yourself to people who already made up their minds, and choosing instead to prove gently and firmly to yourself. So if this story reminded you of your own, I hope you carry this with you. Your worth isn't up for debate. You don't have to earn a place at a table you helped build. You already belong, maybe not in their version of the story, but in your own. If you found something real in this story, something that spoke to your own quiet battles or longings, consider subscribing. I'll be sharing more stories like this, true, raw, and quietly powerful. And who knows, the next one might be yours. Drop your story in the comments. You never know who needs to hear it.